thank you very much indeed for coming along, and thank you, Dean, for inviting me. This is the first time I've actually got to talk about this. I have a row of speaking engagements for next summer, but Dean managed to get in so early that, that I get to do a winter one as well. So I'm going to talk as much today about how this project came about and the experience of doing it, because that's good to show pictures for, as the actual kind of results of the project itself. And yeah, you're going to be feeling in a few minutes' time like, how on earth was this person allowed to do this and call it work for a year? But I can assure you that my university have taken their revenge in full this year. They've given me all the big admin roles like admissions tutor and deputy exams officer and things like that. So I'm kind of looking and feeling like someone at the end of a very, very long term, despite all this stuff you're about to see. So yeah, I'll begin by saying a bit about how the project came about. So I'm a historian of the 19th century, as Dean mentioned, at the University of Birmingham. And it was in the process of writing, this book, which is kind of general reader's introduction to 19th century British history for One World Books, that I began to become aware of how ill-equipped I actually was to write about the geographies of Britain. So despite the fact that I've been obsessed with and travelling to the western corners of the British Isles for 2 decades, I realised that I didn't know how to integrate them into the same kinds of histories that I'd include like London and Edinburgh and Cardiff and Birmingham and Manchester in. So I didn't. This was in part because I was gradually realising that kind of bringing those areas in would kind of transform the whole shape of the British histories that I was trying to write. So by giving them a central rather than a marginal role, the meanings and implications of lots of key historical moments get problematized or reversed. So the so-called Enlightenment might be thought of as the kind of triumph of a few big cities in contrast to what was happening in other regions at that time. So for coastal communities, this was the beginning and the cause of a lengthy dark age rather than enlightenment. So yeah, the abandonment and depopulation of my title ran from kind of the era of enlightened agricultural improvement in the late 18th century to the 1970s, with its greatest intensity between the kind of famine and clearance of the 1830s and 40s and the 1920s. It was therefore as the population of the British Isles was booming that many coastal regions fell to their lowest populations since prehistory. In contrast, much of what were once referred to as the Dark Ages were eras of great island and coastal strength and enlightenment, so an era when power resided on the sea roads before it moved inland later. And such reversals abound on smaller scales as well. So the much celebrated Education Acts of 1870, 1872, they were absolute disasters for lots of these coastal regions because they devalued the languages and the ways of life in those regions and kind of made urban ideals into a kind of standardized norm. And then later on, the grim economic recession of the 1970s was actually a moment of island renaissance that was unprecedented over the previous 2 centuries. And that revival, the effects of that revival are still being felt today. So what I was realising was that all British history looks different when inland cities are made remote by seeing them from Atlantic shorelines. And writing that book made me kind of itch for a way to try and see from that changed perspective. And it's not just kind of historical narratives, but the familiar geographies that we have that these regions erode. So Britain and Ireland's Atlantic shorelines were long connected as closely to Reykjavik, to Bilbao, or to the Moroccan port of Safi as they were to London. There are echoes of Belize on Orkney shores and Nigerian history, the edge of County Mayo. So the communities on the edge of the Atlantic were interlinked and semi-detached from their land masses. And that's evident in the kinds of artifacts that archaeologists unearth there and in the stories of shoreline encounters. So there are very few regions of those Atlantic coastlines that don't have stories of the integration of the Armada into their societies, and lots of them look to Scandinavia for their seagoing expertise. And scarcer still are the regions that didn't kind of benefit or lose out from imperial encounters. But those connections are genuinely geographical ones. They're just as clear in the foliage of these places. So kind of spending a night on the coast in Ireland or Scotland, finding unfamiliar plants, they're highly likely to be misplaced kind of Spanish saxifrages or Norwegian liverworts rather than anything else. So yeah, Lerwick in Shetland or Cape Clear Island in County Cork. One reason they've been so absent from the kind of London-centric histories is not because they lacked significance, but because they upheld kind of different geographical units than places like Gravesend or Grimsby or Dublin did. And yet, at its most extreme, that phenomenon means that there are places on the Irish coastline where sea links to China are evident archaeologically, but sea links to England aren't. So yeah, it's not so much that Britain looks really different from those coastal perspectives, but that Britain begins to look like a kind of useless concept. So you quickly realise that units like Britain or Scotland or England are actually moving through these islands not that much faster than a kayaker. So yeah, my itch to relearn geographies was as strong as that to relearn histories. And the effort to try to deal with all of that stuff was beyond what I could possibly hope to integrate into a little book like that. So at that stage in 2015, I was thinking of trying to do something with this as a really, really long-term project. Something I'd do as a sideline that would take a decade or two later in life. But very suddenly, at the most kind of randomly fortuitous of moments, some completely unforeseen possibilities arose. And the backstory to these possibilities is that for years before this, I'd done lots and lots of my reading and writing outdoors. So I would escape out to mountains with a bag full of books whenever I had loads and loads of stuff that I needed to dig into. Whenever I needed to learn something, just try and get lost somewhere wonderful like Torridon there. And yeah, have no distractions other than hills and books for as long as possible. And I used to write a blog about that called Mountain Coast River. And the new possibilities came from that blog being seen by someone called Adam Nicholson, who for a long time owned the Shiant Islands in the Outer Hebrides and has written wonderful books about them like this one. And Adam contacted his agent and his publisher and asked them to try and help me write a book about the things that I was doing for the blog. So then I went to visit him. There he is, him and his family on That's the Little Bothy on the Shiant Islands. And weeks later, found myself on a road trip with Amy Liptrot, author of The Outrun, and Malachy Talak, author of Undiscovered Islands, thanks to Adam's influence. And as you can imagine, this felt like a really, really nice change from the staff cafeteria at the University of Birmingham. But this was the pressure. I now had to find some way of making this count, of making Adam's intervention mean that I could get that deep immersion in the sidelong perspectives on Britain's historic geographies that I had been itching for. So yeah, weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night in a hotel in London, realising that at 9 a.m. next morning, I would be in the offices of HarperCollins, signing a contract to kayak down all the Atlantic coastlines of Britain and Ireland, which was something I had absolutely no idea whether I could do at all. So yeah, these are coastlines with some of the wildest tides in the world that run many times faster than I can paddle a kayak, and where storm seas gathered over 2,000 miles hit the coast with a force of 3 tons per square foot. But HarperCollins provided me with a new kayak. Is it in the next picture? Yeah, there it is. 5 feet longer than the one that I'd been using before, that was capable of cutting through those kind of swell and breakers. Just about. And they gave me the funding that could create space in my diary to spend 2 weeks of every month for the year out doing the kayaking and out in the archives in these wonderful coastal spots. So yeah, this is what I chose to do. These are the different legs of the journey, starting with, what's the light? Is that the light? Starting with 2 weeks down the Shetland Isles there in July 2016, then 2 weeks down Orkney in August 2016, then 2 weeks down the top half of the Western Isles in September and October down the bottom half, then back up to the top for Cape Wrath in November, around Skye in December. Oh no, sorry, Cape Wrath down Sutherland in November, then across down from Ullapool to Shieldaig in November, around Skye in December, and so on till 3 months in Ireland, then July in Wales and August in Cornwall. Yeah, so this meant that 5 of the first 6 months of the journey was entirely through islands other than the British and Irish mainland, and I ended up visiting over 100 small islands in the course of the year. And for context, it's worth saying that the number people usually give of islands in the British Isles is about 6,000. And of those now, about 200 are populated, whereas the number that have in the past been populated is nearer to 2,000. And yeah, the first stages of industrial modernity, the first communications revolution, those were the eras that made places that had once been central marginal. And then it's the most recent communications revolutions that have promoted kind of reversal and recovery. But yeah, it is worth remembering those numbers if you're ever tempted to think that life on tiny islands is somehow marginal to UK culture, that even after this dramatic depopulation, there are still many more inhabited islands, small inhabited islands, than there are cities in the UK. And yeah, with the wealth of different languages and dialects spoken there, and the intensity of new cultural and productive initiatives, and the ways in which islands have found yet to be modern differently from mainland cities, I think yeah, places like Shetland, Lewis, Barra, Tory Island and Ireland provide unique ways for us to think through the trajectories of history. So yeah, there are a few kind of premises that I began this project from. The first of them is that similar ingredients of rock and wind and waves have made these communities, but that these communities have been transformed into completely different cultures by divergent processes of history. So it's difficult to imagine cultures that are actually much more different from somewhere like Unst in Shetland and Barra in the Western Isles. Barra, of course, famous for its Catholicism. Or even than Lewis and Harris, the single landmass there. They're islands that have created their cultures in stark distinction to each other. I remember asking one man in a pub in Lewis after he told me that Lewis Gaelic is the ugliest Gaelic that there is. It's really guttural Gaelic. Asked him where the most beautiful Gaelic in Scotland is, and he was like, oh, it's Harris, just down the road. And the two of them having kind of been created in contradistinction to each other. So yeah, essentially the first assumption is that those differences between these places can be conceptualized and articulated through comparative unpicking of the island histories, showing how divergence in language and religion and land and sea use took place, and how today's cultures have been shaped by those differences. The second assumption is that these coastlines reveal in particularly striking ways something that is always true, that human-centered histories are never enough, that other species of animal, object, natural processes, and geohistories are all as significant as humans in explaining, for instance, how some of these places flourished and some failed. That for the perspective of every person involved in a project like this, a gannet's eye view or a herring-centered vision is also required. And then the third assumption is that I could gain unique access to these places by kayaking them. There's the simple fact of access. It's not possible to berth a yacht at many once populated islands, but you can land a kayak on the craziest rocky fragments in the ocean. There's also the more historical issue that the experience of small boats was one utterly familiar before the kind of mass drainage, bridge building and communication revolutions of the last 2 centuries. Watery travel has ended up being disciplined out of most of our lives, so that what would once have been miraculous, like instantaneous communication across any earthly distance, has become ordinary, and what was once ordinary, travel by boat across a stretch of fierce sea, seems miraculous. And because of this, attempts to empathise across centuries really fail. There's a poem by Norman MacCaig that captures this. He says that the boat need carry no more than a living person, and there's a meaning, a cargo of centuries. Watch this one, Ancient Callum. He crabs his boat sideways across the tide, every stroke a groan. Ancient Callum no more, but legends afloat. No boat ever sailed with a crew of 1 alone. So being out on those waters could, I felt, be a kind of act of historical empathy, an effort to bridge the divide between myself and the people that I study. But it also became clear that the kayak could gain me access to island communities in ways that were otherwise impossible. And the scale of the generosity that I met with was far beyond what I expected. So the project would have been impossible without long evenings of discussion with islanders whose doorsteps I arrived at dripping. Partway through the journey, a literary scholar called Pippa Marland kindly let me see an interview that she'd just conducted with the absolutely wonderful cartographer called Tim Robinson. And Robinson is an inveterate wanderer of coastlines, and his rich historical Irish language maps are made from the experience of walking and seeing and just hanging around with islanders rather than the act of measuring. So in that interview, he summed up the experience that I was to have. Here he is. Well, no. Yeah, here he is. He says, "Once a wealthy friend with a big car offered to help me in my explorations of Connemara. Since I wanted to revisit a few remote glens, I accepted, and we roared off. Then, I must call in at that cottage, I said, and we squealed to a stop. I knocked at the door, but apart from a twitching curtain, there was no response. Whereas if I had sweated up the hill, fallen off my old bike at the gate, asked for a bucket of water to mend a puncture, etc., all the lore of the valley would have been forthcoming over tea in the kitchen. But even bicycling is inferior to walking in this context. To appear out of the thickets behind an Arran cottage, or scramble down from the bare moon mountains of the Burren into a farmyard is, I find, a disarming approach, introducing me as obviously unofficial and dying for a cup of tea." And before long, I tested this approach on Robinson himself, kayaking right up to his door in the quay in Roundstone village, and I'd hoped he might be willing to spare me half an hour's chat, but I left 9 hours and 2 meals later, laden with wonderful maps. So yeah, the kayak was a multifaceted research tool in itself, something that got people talking about the communities they or their relatives remembered, the ways the languages or mode of fishing have changed over time. So yeah, what I want to do today is begin by briefly trying to give a sense of how the kayaking actually worked, what the experiences of the small boat were like. I want to do that through a short photo essay that I hope can conjure some of the sights and sounds and smells of the journey. Then I'll get to a couple of real examples. So I'll talk for a bit about the island of Havre in Shetland, and then about a little group of islands at the north of Orkney, Ignesholm, and Westray and Papa Westray. So yeah, I began kayaking a few years ago when my partner, Thenos, had a car accident which ended the mountain trips that we used to go on. So I mention this because for any medics in the room, these may be the 2 most interesting pictures that you see all night. So here are a couple of her pelvic x-rays. So there's the injury and the wonderful work that was done on them. So the reason I mention this is that you'll get a much better sense of what being in a kayak is like from pictures with a kayaker in them. So Thenos joined me for a few stretches of the journey, and she is like, she's far braver than I am and also a better kayaker. So yeah, the kinds of conditions she likes to kayak in are offshore gales or more. It's absolutely terrifying. So yeah, sometimes the kayaking takes place in serene spots like this, which is by the Isle of Skye. But such days are the stuff of May and June, not even of September and October. So this is a day we had to breach some really crunching breakers to make it to the Monarch Isles off North Uist. There she is coming into shot. It's not really atypical of the kinds of conditions she likes. Neither is, there she is on a different day climbing some waves. That shot isn't atypical. You get some amazing views from inside waves in a kayak. So this is the moment I destroyed my first camera. And yeah, quite often I'll lose sight of her for a while, and then just suddenly a head will appear, either from the breakers or out in the swell. Suddenly find that you are still close to the other kayaker. But I think the next one is my favourite of these. It's when she'd come to join me off County Mayo in Ireland. And we'd done a long day's paddling through the beginnings of a storm that really hit the next day. And I could tell that she was wanting to play in some white water, so I went and landed and climbed a sea stack and took this picture down from the top. So there she is coming into some nice white watery mess. And yeah, the tough days at sea can often be the most beautiful. The days of mixed weather when you get dark skies inland, but then the sea is all dazzling brightness. Journeys out to sea, out to islands on rough water when the wind drops for evening. So about an hour after fighting through this, just sat there. Absolutely glorious. So that's an island, that's Little Bernera, which is an island off an island off the Isle of Lewis. You get runs through tide races like these with overfalls to find a little placid idyll beyond, in which you're not the only creature seeking shelter. And so that's the deeply historic island of Einhollow in Orkney. I think the next few pictures should really show what I mean by the unique perspective that a kayak can give you. So this picture is a view across the abandoned islands at the southern end of the Outer Hebrides. So Vatersay, Mingulay, Pabay and Barra Head. I clambered up here to see where I was going to kayak and to visit the golden eagles you get up there. And next evening I was kayaking out to those islands in gentle but quite deep swell. It's hard to tell from this, but the swell's about 8 feet high. And the light to the west was bright and golden. And suddenly, as I rode down the hillsides of these waves, I found myself running through vast flocks of eider ducks. So once the most prized of resources up here. And the sight of them taking off and making for Mingulay was just stunning. And that kind of angle on the world is something that you don't really get in any other way. And yeah, that experience of suddenly finding that you're not alone is a frequent one. So you'll look up to see flocks of geese crossing the sky, or the kayak suddenly rocks as a fin kind of sides by. So that's a minke whale that came very, very close to knocking me in. You'll find yourself at the end of a stream of hundreds of gannets pouring out from cliffs until they fill the sky above you and you can hear absolutely nothing but their wings. And you realise what a resource hearing usually is for you when you're working out kind of tidal movements and things like that. The only thing you hear other than their wings is the occasional squawk of a great skewer trying to pluck them out of the sky. And yeah, there's no doubt that the sense of being in a world that the Anthropocene is only beginning to defile is one of the great appeals of kayaking. And it was remarkable to find that every rock up in somewhere like Shetland that had a name that meant Kittiwake Rock would have kittiwakes on it. Whereas as soon as down in Cornwall, every rock named for a bird species would be bare. The shift across that geography was really quite dramatic. And yeah, birds and animals just aren't as afraid of people in kayaks as they are of people on foot. So raptors will approach to investigate. Otters are surprisingly curious, often just stop and stare in disbelief as you drift past. And then birds famous for their noisy attacks on people, such as Arctic terns, seem unperturbed by a kayak drifting by. So there's a little Arctic tern chick up there, which would usually have these parents chittering like mad, but somehow the kayak doesn't have that effect on them. And you have to get used to powerful animals approaching you. So in Orkney, this gannet just powered right up and clamped its bill around the kayak, and just then hung around while I ate lunch. And this seal and some truly ferocious water off Cape Clear seemed to consider me a novelty. Well, these dolphins kind of surrounded the kayak in a wide circle like the enemies in a western. And then just occasionally something will swim alongside for a while, like this otter or this huge bull dolphin. And yeah, then in Orkney, this seal swam alongside for about half an hour, constantly looking out to sea, just sticking by the kayak. And I only found out when I got back to shore that there'd been orca spotted nearby. So wondering whether it was just looking for kind of safety in numbers. And then sometimes the wildlife includes rarities that I'd never normally see. So this is a little auk off the coast of Assynt, birds that never usually come across human beings at all. And this is a long-tailed skua off the north of the Isle of Rona, that's between Skye and the mainland. So yeah, if that's a sense of the wildlife, I'll just very, very briefly give a sense of the sites. As Dean said, I was basically sleeping rough. This is one of my favourite possessions, my little waterproof sleeping bag. So that's the view from Ben Moor on Mull the night before, and then that's the view from the sleeping bag in the morning. And that's, yeah, one of my absolute favourite things, just the rucksack full of books. Because if you don't have a tent, then you carry the books and take your waterproof sleeping bag. And that makes for glorious nights, sometimes with moonlight on cloud tops. And yeah, surprisingly frequently don't have to move in the morning to photograph the wildlife. And then, yes, some places that the kayak gets you to are ones that you'd never imagine existed in the UK. So, more morning creatures. So this is the bottom of the cliffs of Fulla off Shetland, about 20 kilometres off the shore of Shetland, place where the seabirds cliff nesting birds all just nest on the ground because there's nothing to disturb them. Clambering up the cliffs is fun. This is the view looking down from those cliffs. And then just a few more spots. So this is some of the extraordinary rock architecture that you get in Shetland. Great caves from kayaks. The smaller of the two skelligs. Yeah, lots of amazing rocky islands. So yeah, I'll move now on to examples. Now I've tried to give you some kind of sense of the sites. So I've already suggested that lots of these places are now more empty of human habitation than at any time since prehistory. This means that even the remotest fragments of island are layered with rich and often extremely difficult histories. We often hear people say that there are no landscapes in Britain that aren't formed by humans, but personally I think that's as naive as a way of putting it as assuming that any of these places are completely wild. The way I've come to think of it is that lots of these places are shaped by or are characterized by human default rather than human design. They're shaped by past people, but only under the dominating influence of nature. So I'll give you one example, which is the island of Havre in Shetland. So I set out for this place in haunting sea mist, which is known up there as the Har. So that sat sometimes flat against the gentle swell and sometimes a few feet above it. So I was heading out at a little past 4 a.m. and the mist provided excellent wildlife encounters. So this otter standing and watching, and then this red-throated diver, known in Shetland as a rain goose. Lots of them everywhere. So the cloud got darker as I was approaching the crossing. So that's the island there in the kind of gloomy conditions. But the cloud also began to rise. So it was clinging to the moors in the east of the island, so that Havre gradually brightened from the west. And soon it was stranded in a weak kind of wedge of light. And Havre is surrounded by oceanic richness, and seabirds began to surface with sand eels, forests of brown kelp seemed to grasp towards the surface, and the people who lived here until 1923 left behind an archive that's just as rich, including recordings of their voices, which I really must manage to get hold of some actual recordings of for the next time I do talks, that describe life on the island. So before I set out, I'd made notes from the archive that I'd brought with me so that in my kayak I could follow up references to kind of inlets and rocky promontories that they made. I had a poem in the rich Shetland dialect called Mapin Havre to guide me towards a landing. I'm not going to try and read this poem because it would be really embarrassing if I did, but I'll put a couple of snippets of it up on screen to give you a sense of the dialect. So this begins with a warning. So there's the warning. I'm going to move on. And then it provides every detail needed by fishermen to navigate all these headlands. So yeah, it's a recent version of an extraordinary dialect tradition of Shetland verse on navigation and boats put together by Christine De Luca. I'll leave that up for a moment. I'm not expecting people to be able to decipher it at this speed, but just the sense of the kind of inherited geography of this island that is put into verse in this poem about its every inlet and promontory. And yes, small boats that are exactly the length of my kayak are a major feature of Shetland life. So here's another fragment of Shetland dialect verse. I might even try and read this one. Take time, name the boat well, for it is naming a way of life, it is naming an attitude. And then another by Shetland's national poet, who went by the pen name Vargaland, is the most famous poem on the islands. Fragments of battered timber, teak, larch, enduring oak, but from them may be fashioned keel, hasson, routh, and stroke. A homely vessel maybe we build as best we can to take us out of bondage, bound as the boatless man. So every Havre family would have had a little boat called a forarine, with which they rode the local waters. So these are beautiful double-ended Viking-style boats, perhaps the most elegant on all British coastlines. And the word that's always used about these boats is lithesome, so light and flexible that they're said to have pranced with the waves. But the island also had what they called the saily boat, with which they made longer trips laden with peat and with flour. Having followed the poem's directions, I pulled into Northam on the island's southeast corner and was met with an onshore sea of wildflowers and grasses. So over the centuries, the people and goods that entered or left the island all came through this picturesque little gap. So the community's single link to the world beyond was here. And the most substantial ruins are the abandoned village. A wheat here. The most substantial ruins are the abandoned village that's packed tightly into the corner known as the Yard. So these are the ruins of the old Havre village, which was the last place in Shetland's small isles to sustain a population. In 1911, it had 29 occupants from 5 families. And here it is seen from the other side, looking south. And the thing to realise to get the feel of Havre is that everything on this side, everything kind of round this way, all round, is open to the Atlantic, with waves gathered from Newfoundland. Then there are 2 outlying buildings from this village. One is the old schoolhouse, and the other is the imposing trunk of a huge ruined windmill, a sea mark that's visible from many miles away, which we'll come back to in a moment. One of Havre's great assets was a place called Westskerry. Is there a picture? No, I don't have a picture of Westskerry, which is a rough ridge separated from Havre by 100 yards of tidal water. And each spring, island sheep and cattle were swum to Westskerry to protect Havre's crops. And that meagre pasture was therefore an absolutely crucial feature of the islands, without which they might not have survived. But yeah, it's arable richness that the archives record as being Havera's greatest asset. Like so many of these geologically complex islands, it was an unlikely idyll of well-drained, fertile earth, perpetually replenished by soft limestone that intrudes in veins through all the harder rock. From the era of Neolithic field boundaries to the moment when the crofters left, this limestone made Havre a wonderful place to grow crops, and its name probably derives from the Old Norse havr, meaning oats. So the island was generally presented by its last inhabitants as a plentiful home. Gideon Williamson died only in 1999, 76 years after he left Havre, and he remembered his birthplace as unique in Shetland because its land was not just bits of patches here and there, but one great expanse of rockless, weedless loam. You could take a plough and plough the whole lot up. It was entirely clean. Yet the topography did have drawbacks. So there were no streams on Havre, and wells were no substitute, because running water has uses beyond cleaning and drinking. So the most common ruins that I'd passed along other Shetland coasts were small, simple water mills where rivers met the sea. But the people of Havre had to row their grain to Scalloway, which was a 5-mile crossing, and pay for its grinding. And this added labour, and as well as cost and risk to island life. In the 1860s, a solution was dreamt up, which was the only windmill ever attempted in any of these kind of storm-ravaged regions. And the story of this windmill isn't easy to piece together, but it seems the innovator might have been someone called Gifford Lawrenson, who was a skilled mason and had been hired by the Society of Antiquaries with repairing the Iron Age Broch of Mouser, probably Shetland's most famous archaeological site. So between 1848 and 52, the Lawrensons married into Havre families twice, and Gifford's sister and ageing father, who was also a mason, moved to the island. And the significance of Gifford Lawrenson's link to the Broch of Mouser is that the Havre mill is more like ancient Shetland than modern. It's like a round Iron Age edifice in a region with no other circular modern buildings. So it's a landmark now that, like an ancient fort, puts Havre on the map as the most instantly recognisable of all the small isles and constantly used as a navigation point in seafaring. As one local put it, it's a kind of lodestar for where you were. So that navigational function is all well and good, but so many compromises were made with the mill's design to try and help it withstand Shetland weather that it was useless for grinding grain, and journeys to Scalloway had to continue. Then in the village, small buildings are packed into a narrow isthmus with surprising neatness, because several of these crofts were built at the same time when in the 18th century landlords tried to squeeze extra rent out of Havre by forcing 3 new families to join the existing population. And a few Gaelic place names around the coast suggest the incomers might have been Scots, not Shetlanders, so 2 very different cultures forced together. But the overwhelming impression among these ruins is of how communal life must have been on this island. So doors and windows of these small, neat houses look straight onto each other, while amenities like the one village kiln were prominent shared spaces. So in most of Scotland at this time, each croft would have had a kiln of its own, but Havre had one central one around which other things were gathered. Inside houses, outlines of 2 rooms, the butt and ben, are still obvious. But the yard here isn't actually uninhabited. So Fulmers use the village walls as crags. You can see them across the screen here. It's very difficult to get any pictures around this area without them being photobombed by at least one Fulmer. So I stood in the doorway of one of the houses to take this. They're all over the place. Oh no, sorry, I stood in the doorway of one of the houses to take that one. Despite the healthy population in 1911, the last residents left Havre in 1923. Herring shoals had moved offshore, making the task of catching them a job not for days, but for weeks. So Jessie Goodlad, who was born on Havre in 1903, explained the impact of this. And I am going to come back to the Fulmers. She said, They left because there were nobody left to gang back and forth with the boat, because the young men was a leaving. Well, they weren't a leaving exactly. They were going to the fishing. There were nobody to steer this boat, this sailing boat, back and forth. And fulmars spread across Britain's Atlantic coasts in the early decades of the 20th century. The first of those birds may well have begun to nest on Havre at about the same time as the people left. I talked one night to a retired Shetland fisherman who remembered the time he was summoned as a child to come and see this strange bird known in Shetland as the marley. So this is just one of countless examples of how there's as much social change in the wildlife of these regions and as little permanence as there is among the people. But yeah, few events demonstrate that more fully than the sudden expansion of the fulmar across the North Atlantic world, which I like to call the most dramatic conquest of Britain since 1066, although I might be exaggerating a bit. So yeah, the arrival of thousands of fulmars has transformed the experience of Havre. But fulmars aren't the only change in the island's bird life. The hilltop rigs where crops were grown have also been conquered. So these thin strips of rich land were named in detail. They were called things like the Peary Worlds, the Hula Planks, and the Cucalori. And now the place where kale and oats were grown is barely traceable beneath the same foliage there would have been had people never been there. Ruling this feral domain is another victor in the struggles between species, the bonxie or great skua. Every rocky vantage, whether a corner of the old schoolhouse or a chunk detached from a long flattened dike, is now a watchtower for one of these terrifying birds. So those changes show the entanglement of human and natural worlds. Havre life was transformed and ended by the movement of fish offshore, while many differences between Havre today and in the past are a result of these changing social lives and the histories of birds and animals. At the end of my Shetland journey, I spent a night in the shadow of the Havre windmill's twin, the Broch of Mouser. And this is a domineering monument to human belligerence, yet now its walls reverberate with the gentlest purring. So storm petrels nest in the cracks between stones, and as I settled down to sleep, hundreds of the tiny stormies fluttered across my sight lines. So masons making ready for war had unwittingly built the perfect hive for these sparrow-like seafarers. And incidentally, they are the best smelling of all the small birds. Yeah, so the overwhelming feeling when visiting Havre is of tragedy. So these are abandoned places that were once filled with people and with their magnetic personalities and pleasures and regrets that shine through from recordings of their voices still. But there might be the tiniest consolation in the idea that in a world where humans wage wars of conquest not just against each other but against almost every species on the planet, the agency of animals is reshaping realms in which humans are more than ever peripheral. So next, to finish, I'll move south to Orkney and the island of Westray, which is the most northerly place in Orkney. So boats play nowhere near the same role in Orkney story and identity as they do in Shetland. It's often said that Shetlanders are fishermen with ploughs, while Orcadians are crofters with boats. The balance just shifted slightly. But the thing that struck me most in Westray was the way that these formulations miss the crucial bit out. For every task at sea in Westray's past, there were a dozen lost jobs, not on the land, but at the shoreline. So Orkney has a tradition called Udal law, imported from Norway in the 9th century, which means that where in most of Britain land ownership ends at the high tide mark, in Orkney it goes right down to low tide. And that tradition has been used successfully in the 21st century to fight attempts by multinational corporations to exploit Orkney shores. So the first part of Westray I landed at was a tiny skerry called Akeness Home. This is nothing more than a flat pile of shattered flagstones in the ocean. But a crudely built structure like a misplaced garden shed is perched on it. Today this would be really unpleasant, cramped conditions for one. But here in the 19th century, 4 or 5 men would spend their summer collecting seaweed with rakes, returning to Westray only at weekends. They'd burn heaps of seaweed, sending huge palls of blue beige smoke floating to the island and obscuring all sights and smells behind the infamous kelp reek. And the result was an alkali used in distant cities to make soap and glass. So this little rock, hundreds of miles from the nearest city, was as much an industrial centre as Manchester or Coalbrookdale. Yet this tiny skerry is more famous for another industry of the shoreline. On this spot, countless ships were wrecked. So in the archive, I listened to recordings of Westray folk describing aspects of island life. So the windfall of goods from Akeness was really prominent in the things they wanted to talk about. The most infectious guffaw to come from any islander came from Tommy Rendell when he was asked the question, "Did any pilfering go on?" So he told of mistakes made with things washed up from wrecks, such as the time when half the stoves of Westray were ruined because anthracite was mistaken for domestic coal. He told of customs men whose task to prevent the contents of these wrecks from disappearing made them the most hated people in the islands, except perhaps the landlords. So customs men were the butt of endless plots, tricks and jokes. They were known locally as gadgers, and these snooping officials are still remembered today in a current Orkney phrase. So Orcadians refer to unruly children as running round the house like a gadger. But Westray's bounty of the sea was hard-earned, so the people of these islands saved countless lives, rowing small boats out in all conditions to save crews from stranded vessels. And the first sea creatures I saw as I rounded Westray's northern headlands were seals. That's the next picture. And it was only 2 days later that I suddenly realised how many structures I'd been passing were placed with sightlines to rocks where seals lounge. So they were shooting stations. This is a seal shooting station. Seal killing was once the most enticing of pursuits. A single seal skin sometimes had as much monetary value as a week's farm labour. And a seal served lots of purposes, providing food, warmth, light from oiled lamps, and even protection for harvest machinery. Anything vulnerable to rust was coated in seal fat for the winter. So there's a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks that this use of marine fats and oils might be traditional, in contrast to modern, which is that it was oil from basking sharks caught off these coasts that was used to lubricate the the Apollo moon missions. And it wasn't so much the import of cheap oils as new passions for wild animals that put an end to the seal trade. Recordings in the archive suggest the economic benefits of the seal to have changed rather than died out. As one Westray resident, Alex Costi, recalled about the end of seal hunting, all the greenies, the likes of Greenpeace, were protesting so much that totally destroyed the markets. But I have discovered nowadays how easy it is to get money for showing a tourist a seal, that I am now the most reformed seal hunter you would ever come across. And in the archive, I also listened to discussions of the subtle ethical considerations behind the collecting of eggs and wildfowl. So the first brood of lapwings, Tommy Rendell said, was always gathered in. But then lapwings were off limit for the rest of the year. The second brood being further into the summer, being more likely to be raised successfully. And I was intrigued to find that some of those interviewed hadn't entirely shaken off the old habits of seeing wildfowl as food. And I really love this quote. So this is Alex Costi again. He says, "The guillemots that came here, they still come here. You'll not get any more here unless you build more cliffs, because the cliffs are full of them. It was always a great source of food for the old folk, you see. No expense. You didn't have any vets bills or anything. You know, it's a very dark coloured flesh that's in them. Sometimes they were just stewed, but usually they were just boiled. You know, boiled until the flesh fell off the bones, fried up with onions. We used to eat eider ducks more than guillemots because there were more eider ducks in our area. And cormorants was better still, especially the brown ones, the juvenile ones. The meat in that is tender, better than any of the other birds, I would say, apart from curlews." And this is the bit I love. "But nobody seems to eat that sort of things nowadays. They are just dying of old age and going to waste." So these practices don't appear in the historical record. They weren't part of the measurable economy. Never had there been an export market for the meat of young brown cormorants, however tender they were. So the community activity of catching spoots, which are razor clams, on the biggest ebb tide of the year, for which West grade children were taken out of school, could produce a huge surplus. But without refrigeration, there was no potential for those to be exported either. These shoreline practices, unrecorded in tallies of import and export, are the great forgotten industries of these Atlantic coasts. They were local but far from peripheral because so many lives depended on them. So I'll just finish very briefly with a couple of the big points that the project's intended to make about these islands. So yeah, as I said at the beginning, Britain's islands have been through a horrific era of crisis, the period between 1840 and 1970 being absolutely disastrous, seeing the total devaluing of island lifeways and island languages, those education acts of the 1870s being key in that, despite still being so widely celebrated. So yeah, that period saw the increasing division of Britain into wealthy and poorer zones, so regions that had had similar land values, Scottish Highlands, London, having values separated by hundreds-fold. Attempts to export Enlightenment science in West Coast islands had awful consequences. So yeah, improved farming, transforming what had once been a perfectly functional system, these lazy beds, the kind of potato growing systems that made areas like this on Harris look very much like parts of Peru, those being replaced with kind of large, square, improved fields. It was that shift that made the spread of potato blight possible and led directly to mass famine, disease, and the abandonment of rich, fertile land across island regions of Ireland and Scotland. So yeah, 1840 to 1970 was a dark age. And in some places that dark age continues. In Ireland, for instance, official focus is still so much on the land and on farming that coastal communities are sold out at every turn. So in 1973, when Ireland joined the EU, the government protected farming by giving up lots of its claims to the sea. So profits from Irish oil go directly to Norway and Russia. Vast Dutch and Spanish factory ships have far greater quotas in Irish waters than do Irish fishermen. And just last year, the seaweed rights on the Irish shore, the most traditionally local resource of all, were all sold off to a large Canadian company. In that environment, a fishing community on islands like the Arans has become impossible. And it's worth noting that the Aran Islands aren't failing because their mode of fishing is outmoded, but because the legal, commercial, and political structures imposed on them are outmoded. Ecologically, culturally, the islands are on the cutting edge, but the mainland forces they have to deal with lag behind. The situation in Ireland could only have come about through total separation of land knowledge and sea knowledge, and the forgetfulness of inland cities that working coastal communities even exist, and that they're the best ecological hope for kind of sustainable management of the ocean in the kind of ecological crises that we face. Yet there are many regions along these coastlines that have escaped that kind of crisis. If I had more time, I would talk a lot about the region of Ness on the Isle of Lewis, which has had a huge cultural revival in recent years, since the 1970s, because certain people in Ness saw the great significance of shifting narratives about the area, of giving a sense of dignity to the kind of fishing customs of the area and of putting resources behind that. So Ness managed to get a large amount of funding in the 70s from a body called the Van Leer Foundation to do lots of kind of reconstructing of historical ways of using the coastline, which have led to some really large movements that exist there today. So I think I've probably run to the end of the time that I'm allowed to talk to, even if I've not outstayed my welcome by a long, long way. And I'd love to get some questions, partly because I'd love to see which different aspects of this, as I've tried to cover several different things, actually resonate with people and which don't. So yeah, I'd be really willing to take as many questions as people have. Thank you for listening.